with a different scripture. Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, knowledge of God, not burned offerings. If you know something about Jephtah, you may understand why it's helpful to frame his story that way. I'll tell you something that is not a surprise to any of you. Parenting is hard. And for a myriad of reasons. One of those being that as a parent, I am supposed to know better. I'm supposed to know better than my child, as my child looks at me full of disobedience, full of sarcasm and attitude, full of disrespect. I'm supposed to know better. That my children do not give me the excuse to respond in kind. But I should, instead, know that there's no reason for me to ever be anything other than patient. There's no reason for me to ever be anything other than kind, save for my own ego, save for my own temper, save for my own stubbornness, and those things are real, and sometimes they win. But I'm supposed to know better. We are supposed to know better when it comes to God. We are supposed to be the people who know who God is, who understand God's character. And almost always, you can trace our health or lack thereof, spiritually speaking, and how that translates into our entire lives based on if we have understood the character of God well. With all of those things in mind, we're going to look at the story of Jephtah. And before we dive in to Judges chapter 10, it's tough to jump into Judges in the middle because Judges is a genius work of literature. It is very carefully compiled, and there are these stories build so closely on one another that you will undoubtedly not catch all of the wonderful things in each text unless you read the whole book with a magnifying glass. And so some things that we'll highlight to get us caught up before we look at Jephtah. Firstly, the book of Judges follows a certain pattern. And the pattern goes like this. The people of God have peace and security in the land until they begin to chase after false gods, or until they begin to do things that are unwise or unrighteous and harm one another, and at which point God will hand them over to another power, and they will be under the rule of this other power, under the oppression of this other power for some number of years. Then eventually they will cry out to God and say, "Oh God, please come rescue us." And God will send and appoint a judge to come and lead the people back. And the judge will overthrow the power that is oppressing the Israelites, and the Israelites will repent and turn back to God, and there will be peace in the land, and rinse and repeat. That's the cycle of the book of Judges. Chapter 1 in the book of Judges straight up lays that out and says, this is the cycle of the book you're about to read. And you can trace that is what this cycle is supposed to be. All of the pieces of that cycle aren't always there in all of the stories, and they're not always there in all of the right ways in the stories, especially as the book lingers. You start to get the sense that actually the pattern of Judges is a flush. It's a downward spiral down the toilet bowl. The story's getting worse and worse. The people getting further and further away from God, until eventually all we're left with is mess. The book of Judges begins with the people of Israel weeping. And it ends with the people of Israel weeping. And in this chapter, chapter 11, the very middle chapter in the book of Judges, it ends with the people establishing a tradition of weeping every year. Judges is a book that is surrounded both on the sides and in the middle with weeping. Judges contains some of the most hilarious stories in the Bible, some of the most heinous stories in the Bible, but it is above all a tragedy. And this story in particular, the story of Jephtah, is a tragedy. So to begin, we're going to read Judges starting in chapter 10, verse 6, and then we're going to read all through the end of chapter 11. So it is a fairly lengthy reading. I will do my best to keep your attention. But be paying attention for some things. Be paying attention throughout the story for what God does and what the people do. Pay attention to the decline of Jephthah's story. Judges chapter 10, starting in verse 6. Then the Israelites again did things that the Lord saw as evil. They served the Baals and the Astartes, as well as the gods of Aram, Sidon, Moab, the Ammonites, and the Philistines. They went away from the Lord and didn't serve him. The Lord became angry with Israel and handed them over to the Philistines and the Ammonites. Starting that year, for the next 18 years, they beat and bullied the Israelites, especially all the Israelites who lived on the east side of the Jordan, in the territory of the Ammonites in Gilead. The Ammonites also crossed the Jordan to make raids into Judah, Benjamin, and the houses of Ephraim. So Israel was greatly distressed. The Israelites cried out to the Lord, "We've sinned against you, for we went away from our God and served the Baals." The Lord replied to the Israelites, "When the Egyptians, Amorites, Ammonites, Philistines, Sidonians, Amalekites, and Maonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, didn't I rescue you from their power? But you have gone away from me and served other gods, so I won't rescue you anymore. Go cry out to the gods you've chosen. Let them rescue you in your times of distress." The Israelites responded to the Lord, "We've sinned. Do to us whatever you see as right, but please save us this time." They put away the foreign gods from among them and served the Lord. And the Lord could no longer stand to see Israel suffer. The Ammonites called out their army and made camp in Gilead, while the Israelites gathered and set up their camp at Mizpah. Gilead's rulers said to each other, "Whoever is willing to launch the attack against the Ammonites will become leader over those living in Gilead." Now, Jephtah, the Gileadite, was a mighty warrior. Gilead was his father, but he was a prostitute's son. Gilead's wife gave birth to other sons for him, and when his wife's sons grew up, they drove Jephtah away. They told him, "You won't get an inheritance in our father's household because you're a different woman's son." So Jephtah ran away from his brothers and lived in the land of Tob. Worthless men gathered around Jephtah and became his posse. Sometime afterward, the Ammonites made war against Israel, and when the Ammonites attacked Israel, Gilead's elders went to bring Jephtah back from the land of Tob. They said to him, "Come be our commander so we can fight against the Ammonites." But Jephtah replied to Gilead's elders, "Aren't you the ones who hated me and drove me away from my father's household? Why are you coming to me now when you're in trouble?" Gilead's elders answered Jephtah, "That may be, but now we're turning back to you. So come fight with us and fight the Ammonites. Then you will become the leader over us and everyone who lives in Gilead." And Jephtah said to Gilead's elders, "If you bring me back to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord gives them over to me, I alone will be your leader." Gilead's elders replied to him, "The Lord is our witness. We will surely do what you said." So Jephtah went with Gilead's elders, and the people made him leader and commander over them. At Mizpah, before the Lord, Jephtah repeated everything he had said. Then Jephtah sent messengers to the Ammonite king, saying, "Now what's the problem between us that you've come against me to make war in my land?" The Ammonite king responded to Jephthah's messengers, "Now, when the Israelites were coming up from Egypt, they seized my land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, all the way to the Jordan. Now give it back peacefully." Then Jephtah again sent messengers to the Ammonite king and said to him, Jephtah states, "Israel didn't seize the land of the Moabites or the land of the Ammonites. When they were coming up from Egypt, the Israelites went through the desert to the Reed Sea and came to Kadesh. Then the Israelites sent messengers to the king of Edom, saying, 'Please allow us to pass through your land.' But the Edomite king refused. They sent the same request to the king of Moab, and he was unwilling, so the Israelites stayed at Kadesh. Later they journeyed into the desert, but went around the lands of Edom and Moab, arriving on the east side of the land of Moab and setting up camp on the other side of the Arnon. They never entered Moabite territory because the Arnon was the boundary of Moab. Then the Israelites sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites and king of Heshbon, and said to him, 'Please allow us to pass through your land to our own place.' Yet Sihon didn't trust the Israelites to pass through his territory. He assembled his entire army, set up camp at Jahaz, and went to war with the Israelites. The Lord, Israel's God, handed over Sihon and his entire army to the Israelites, and they defeated Sihon. So the Israelites took possession of all the land of the Amorites who were living in that area. They took possession of all the Amorite territory from the Arnon to the Jabbok and from the desert to the Jordan. So now that the Lord, Israel's God, has driven out the Amorites before his people Israel, will you take possession of their land? Shouldn't you possess what your God Chemosh has given you to possess? And shouldn't we possess everything that the Lord, our God, has given to us to possess? Do you now have a better case than Moab's king Balak, Zippor's son? Did he make an accusation against the Israelites or go to war with them? Why didn't you take back this territory while the Israelites lived in Heshbon and its villages, and Aurora and its villages, and in all the towns along the branches of the Arnon for 300 years? I haven't sinned against you, but you're doing me wrong by making war against me. Let the Lord, who is the judge, decide today between the Israelites and the Ammonites." But the Ammonite king refused to listen to the message Jephtah had sent him. Then the Lord's Spirit came on Jephtah. He passed through Gilead and Manasseh, then through Mizpah and Gilead, and from there he crossed over to the Ammonites. Jephtah made a solemn promise to the Lord. "If you will decisively hand over the Ammonites to me, then whatever comes out the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Ammonites, will be given over to the Lord. I will sacrifice it as an entirely burnt offering." Jephtah crossed over to fight the Ammonites, and the Lord handed them over to him. It was an exceptionally great defeat. He defeated 20 towns, from the Aror to the area of Minnith, as far on as Abel Karamin. So the Ammonites were brought down before all the Israelites. But when Jephtah came to his house in Mizpah, it was his daughter who came out to meet him with tambourines and dancing. She was an only child. He had no other son or daughter except her. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me to my knees. You are my agony, for I opened my mouth to the Lord, and I can't take it back." She replied to him, "My father, you've opened your mouth to the Lord, so you should do to me just what you've promised. After all, the Lord carried out just punishment for you on your enemies, the Ammonites." Then she said to her father, "Let this one thing be done for me. Hold off for 2 months, and let me and my friends wander the hills in sadness, crying over the fact that I've never had children." "Go," he responded, and he sent her away for 2 months. She and her friends walked on the hills and cried because she would never have children. When 2 months had passed, she returned to her father, and he did to her what he had promised. She had not known a man intimately, but she gave rise to a tradition in Israel, where for 4 days every year Israelite daughters would go away to recount the story of the Gileadite, Jephthah's daughter. So, this story is a tragedy. And I wish we had time to dig into all of just the cool things in this story, because there are lots of cool things. And in fact, this is the kind of story that you spend a long time chewing on, especially because there's so many different allusions or connections to other stories in the Bible. You can picture a connection between Jephtah and Joseph, brothers outcasted and driven away by their other brothers who return to fulfill God's purposes. You can imagine talking about Jephtah and his daughter and Abraham and Isaac as Abraham is faced with this heart-wrenching test to sacrifice his son. You can think about Hannah and Samuel as she dedicates her son to the Lord in a solemn promise. You can also think about one of the strangest stories in all of the Bible in 2 Kings chapter 3, when the Israelites are going to war against the Moabites, and the Moabite king sacrifices his son to the god Molech, and it works. Wrath comes against the Israelites, and they're driven away, unsuccessful in their endeavors. There are many more things we could dig into. This is a fascinating story, but more than fascinating, it's a tragedy. But it doesn't start out that way. At the beginning, Jephtah is a victim of his circumstances. He did not choose how he was born, but there he was, born nonetheless. He did not choose his lineage, but there it was, nonetheless. And because of it, he's driven away. He's driven away into the wilderness, and he becomes a gang leader. Worthless men surround him, and he becomes leader of a posse. However, he is a mighty warrior. And so when the people come sniveling back and say, hey, excuse me, Jephtah, why don't you come back and help us fight our battles here? He strikes a good deal. Okay, well, seems like the shoe's on the other foot now. Who needs who? In fact, let me make it very clear. We're going to go over this step by step multiple times. If I come and do this with you, and the Lord, Jephtah's already giving credit to the God, if the Lord is the one that hands the Ammonites over to me, I will be your only leader over all of you. Yes, okay, fine. You got us in a bind, fine, Jephtah. We're not happy about it, but what else can we do? Come and lead us. They make Jephtah their leader, make him their commander. And Jephtah, the mighty warrior, with a gang and a posse and a newfound army beside him, does not march headlong into battle. He goes for diplomacy. It's exactly what you would hope of the kind of leader that God calls. He's not bloodthirsty or quick to conflict. He tries to resolve this with an accurate history lesson. He tries to go back and negotiate and to say, wait. I'm sensing some hostility here. What's wrong? And the king says, I want my stuff back. And Jephtah says, actually, it's not your stuff. Actually, if you go back and consult the records, our people tried really hard to just pass through your land. And when you said no, we tried to walk around it. But it wasn't good enough. And so your people made war against us, and sorry, but we won. If you're crying about it now, go cry to your God. And we'll stand behind ours. And at this point, I think the king realizes he's going to get out negotiated. Doesn't listen to Jephtah anymore. It's only at this point in the story. Jephtah has done everything right up to this point in the story. Jephtah has done whatever he can to survive. He has agreed to come back and to give God the credit. He has sought peaceful resolution instead of violence. He has faithfully held to the story of God's people. He's tried everything he can. And now, only when war is coming, the Spirit of God comes on Jephtah. There are 4 people in the book of Judges that we're told explicitly the Spirit of God comes over. And you can trace the degradation of the stories of the people of Israel through what happens when the Spirit of God comes over people. The first person the Spirit of God comes over is Othniel. Othniel is the very first judge. His story is very short because he simply does everything right. Othniel is the model judge. The people rebel against God. God hands them over. They cry out to God. God appoints Othniel. The Spirit of the Lord comes over Othniel. He saves the people. The people come back. The land has rest. End of story. The next person that the Spirit of God comes over is Gideon. And we remember a little bit of Gideon's story. Usually we remember the middle bit of Gideon's story, maybe a little bit of the beginning, but it doesn't actually end very well. He actually leaves a bad legacy. And Gideon and his descendants really mess things up. Go read about Gideon and read about Abimelech. It's not pretty. Gideon's a pretty mixed bag. The last person that the Spirit of God is going to come over is Samson. And again, we like the stories of Samson because they're fun and they make good flannel graphs. But if you haven't read those stories in a while, Samson is not a good character. Samson is exactly the opposite of the sort of leader he is supposed to be. He is supposed to be set out as a Nazirite, a special vow for a special kind of leader. And instead, what we get is a petulant, bloodthirsty, egotistical maniac. Samson is the biggest baby in the whole Bible. He just happens to be the strongest, too. The Spirit of God coming over people in the book of Judges does not mean they are about to make every wise decision. It means they're about to be filled with power to make some really good or some really bad decisions. And in Jephtah's story, it's actually when the Spirit of God comes over him that everything starts to go wrong. The first thing out of his mouth is to make this completely unprompted, completely unnecessary rash vow. The first thing that comes out of my door, if you give me this victory, God. His faith in God is already starting to wane immediately after being filled with God's Spirit. Before, he's just saying, I'm going to come and if we're going to win, the Lord's going to hand it over. And now he's saying, okay, maybe I need to sweeten the deal for God. I'm a good negotiator, right? The first thing that comes out of my house, I'll sacrifice. I don't know what he was hoping for. There's not really any good answers. But he makes this completely unnecessary vow. And then goes off, wins the battle. And then he comes home. His daughter comes out the door. The first thing he does is blame her. Why did you have to come out of the door? You have brought me agony. What a loving father in that moment. And he follows through with the vow that he made. We'll get to that in a second. The end of Jephtah's story, we actually stopped his story before it ends. You might think that's a pretty tragic end. It actually is not even the end. The end of Jephtah's story is he leads Israel in a civil war. And at the end of Jephtah's story is the first story in the book of Judges that leaves out this line that's been at the end of every story beforehand, and the land had rest for so many years. Jephtah leaves the land fragmented, torn, bloodied, and not restful. These are all of the things that he does after being filled with God's Spirit. So, let's move to the main event. Jephtah comes home. His daughter runs out, and he says, I've made this vow to the Lord. And his daughter said, I hate, by the way, having to say Jephtah's daughter. She doesn't even get a name. As we move through the story, and you can also trace there's a lot of ways where you can trace the toilet flush of Judges. See how the the people in the margins, the people on the fringes, get treated in the book of Judges. Early on, we see heroes like Jael, who nails a tent peg through Sisera's head and is praised as a hero. And now we just have to say the Gileadite, Jephtah's daughter, because we don't even know her name. She says, well, I guess this is what we have to do, Dad, if that's what you're telling me. And he says, yeah, it is. She gets one little respite, and here he goes. It's funny. When Jephtah is negotiating with the king of the Ammonites, actually, I said he had an accurate history lesson. There's one weird detail in there. He says to the Ammonite king, why don't you be satisfied with what your God, Chemosh, has given you? And we'll be satisfied with what the Lord, our God, has given us. It's strange that he chooses this one detail. Chemosh is in almost no literature in the ancient Near East is Chemosh the god of the Ammonites. Usually, Chemosh is the god of the Philistines. Usually, the god of the Ammonites is Molech. Molech is the god that demanded child sacrifices. We're left with this begged question at the end of the story. Was Jephtah a faithful Israelite, or was he a faithful Ammonite? Do you remember the story that happened in chapter 10 that we read? You might think it's weird to begin our reading there when Jephtah's story doesn't start till chapter 11, but actually, it's quite instructive. And the story comes there for a reason. The story starts with the Israelites rebelling against God, no surprise there, and turning back to God, saying, God, we've sinned, please forgive us. And God says, no. God says that's one time too many. God says, I'm not saving you anymore. You love these foreign gods so much, go get saved by them. And the people rightly say, we've sinned. Do with us as you see fit. And they still, even after God has told them no, they turn back, start following the Lord. They throw themselves on the mercy of God because it's the only place they have left to go. They throw themselves on the character of God because it's the only thing left that can save them. And God changes God's mind. God takes back what God said, does something different than God had just said. God decreed something. This is what I'm going to do. And in just a moment later, when God's children have thrown themselves on his mercy, he says, never mind. I can't stand to see it anymore. I'll save you again. That is who God is. You know, oftentimes we talk about Jephtah's sacrifice as this heroic, faithful endeavor. That he made this vow, rash as it may have been, but he kept it. Jephtah didn't understand God. God has just shown what fatherhood is all about. No matter what you have said, no matter if God himself decrees it, when it comes to the children's suffering, you stop it. When people throw themselves on your character, you say, okay, mercy it is. Do you really think that God would have dealt harshly with Jephtah for saying, whoa. I made a rash vow, and this isn't just going to affect me. It's not just going to affect my chicken. We're talking about a child here. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Knowledge of God, not burned offerings. We are supposed to know better. If we do not understand who God is, we will do terrible things out of faith. If we do not understand who God is, we will get it wrong and people will get hurt. We are supposed to know better. Part of the reason why we're doing things like these daily spiritual devotion things, part of the reason why we stress spending time in prayer and study, part of the reason why we stress getting to know God is because understanding the character of God is the only thing that saves us from ourselves. It's the only thing that stops us from being as boneheaded as Jephtah. We make decisions. Sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. Sometimes we think too long, sometimes we're too rash. We make decisions. Sometimes those decisions cause joy. Sometimes they cause pain. Most of the time they cause a little bit of both or just a lot of indifference. For those of you who are here this morning, we had a pretty robust conversation together in our family meeting. Talked about a lot of things. And there were many, many more opinions held than we even got to hear. A lot of people think a lot of things. As we continue to make decisions, which we must, as we continue as a congregation to discern the best we can what it means to faithfully follow God, the number one thing we must get right is God's character. The best question to ask yourself or to ask someone else when they lay out a theological stance on an issue for you is, what do you think that stance reveals about the character of God? And that is an important conversation to have. It's the most important conversation to have. Following God's not easy. Faith is not easy. Wisdom is not easy. Discernment is not easy. Forgiveness is not easy. Mercy is not easy. None of these things are easy. But parenting isn't either. And we learn from our Father how to do it, that we might take care of one another as well. May we continue to search earnestly and deeply for the heart of God, so that we might faithfully and wisely follow God's character with one another.